Hello and welcome. My name is Matt Rojansky, and I'm director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you all for joining us for our fourth installment of the Global Perspectives on Russia series. Today, we'll be joined by Norwegian State Secretary Audun Halvorsen, Mike Sfrega, director of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute and Global Risk and Resilience Program, and Dan Hamilton, director of the Wilson Center's Global Europe Program, for a conversation on Norwegian-Russian relations. Before I start, I'd like to remind everybody you can keep up to date with our upcoming events, including in this series, and our publications on our website, and follow our podcasts, Kennan X, and our newest podcast, The Russia File, wherever you get your podcast. You can also find our latest analysis of events in Russia and the region on our blogs, The Russia File and Focus Ukraine. If during the course of today's event you have a question, including right now, feel free to submit questions in advance. You can submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org. You can tweet it to @KennanInstitute or post it to our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when sending in questions. It makes it more likely that your question will be asked. Now I'm going to introduce my colleagues, Dan Hamilton and Mike Sfrega, and Mike will then in turn introduce and moderate the discussion with State Secretary Halvorsen. Dan Hamilton is our, of course, new and distinguished director of the Global Europe program here at the Wilson Center. He's also the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Distinguished Fellow and is a widely recognized expert on U.S. foreign policy and European, Eurasian, and transatlantic security, economic, and political affairs. He's testified on many occasions before committees of the U.S. Congress and European parliaments, and is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins SAIS, where he co-leads the school's postdoctoral program on the United States, Europe, and World Order. Previously at SAIS, he was founding director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations, and for 15 years also served as executive director of the American Consortium for European Union Studies. You can find Dan's full bio on the Wilson Center website. My colleague, Dr. Mike Sfrega, is founding director of the Polar Institute and director of the Global Risk and Resilience Program at the Wilson Center. He is an Alaskan and a geographer by training, and his work focuses on the changing geography of the Arctic and Antarctic landscapes, Arctic policy, and the impacts and implications of a changing climate on political, social, economic, environmental, and security regimes in the Arctic. Mike's also author of the biography Bradford Washburn, A Life of Exploration, is an affiliate professor at the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and co-director of the University of the Arctic's Institute for Arctic Policy, and has served on a number of nonprofit boards and advisory committees, including as past chairman of the Institute of the North. So it's a great pleasure to be able to hand over this conversation to Mike, and I'll be happy to join in later after we have heard from the secretary. Please.
Matt, thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to join you and our colleague Dan Hamilton for another Kennan Institute event. A note of appreciation to the staff of the Kennan Institute, our Global Europe program, and the Polar Institute for all of their assistance. We simply can't do any of these programs without that talented group of colleagues. The Norwegian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and members of the Foreign Minister's Office in Oslo. As always, their support and assistance is essential and always appreciated. You know, as the pace of change in the Arctic continues to quicken, environmentally, economically, and politically, there's a renewed focus on the geopolitical landscape of the region. And for many reasons we'll learn about today, Norway is an important nation when it comes to reshaping and reimagining the future of the Arctic. And it has a complex relationship with the Russian Federation, a nation that also plays an important role in shaping the future of the Arctic. This relationship has a long history of cooperation and economic ties, as well as long-standing security concerns. In fact, Norway just released their High North White Paper, which lays out the country's vision for their Arctic region. The paper provides insight into foreign policy, security, and economic development in their Arctic, but each component of the White Paper will undoubtedly impact Norwegian-Russian relations well into the future. And this is why we're so pleased to highlight today the state of Norwegian-Russian relations and their future trajectory. So it's with this backdrop that I welcome Mr. Audun Halvorsen, State Secretary to the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Secretary Halvorsen has held several key positions in the Norwegian government, including political advisor to the Norwegian Minister of Defense and political advisor on defense and foreign affairs, as well as defense policy, scrutiny, and constitutional affairs for the Conservative Party parliamentary group. So it's a pleasure to turn over the virtual floor to Secretary Halvorsen. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you for hosting this event at the Wilson Center and to give me this opportunity to give an overview of Norway's relations with Russia and the Norwegian government's Russia policy. And as a small European country bordering Russia, but of course firmly grounded in the Western community of values and interests, not least as a founding member of NATO going back to 1949, it is obvious that the relationship is a key factor in Norway's foreign, security, and defense policy, and very high on any Norwegian government's agenda. And it is a relationship that needs to be managed in good times and in challenging times, and in a way that contributes to stability and predictability in the region. So as you all know, Norway and Russia are neighbors in the high north. We share a 200-kilometer land border between Troms and Finnmark County on the Norwegian side and Murmansk Oblast on the Kola Peninsula. And then there are a few thousand kilometers of sea border stretching north from there. So this means that my initial remarks will focus primarily on the Arctic, on high north issues and security policy, but of course the relationship goes beyond that, and we can touch upon that in the discussion later. But let me start by highlighting the two factors that shape our relations with Russia today, that have done so for decades and will undoubtedly continue to do so in the future. And the first is Norway's membership in NATO. Our decision in 1949 to be among the founding nations of the alliance placed us firmly in the Western camp of democracies and embracing a policy of collective defense against the Soviet Union that presented a clear military challenge. And after the thaw through the 1990s and the early 2000s, the recent years, I would say, unfortunately, have returned us to a situation marked by suspicion and the lack of trust. And we see, as you all know, today's Russian leadership regards NATO as a challenge. It continues to act in ways that are contrary to our security interests and the security interests of our close allies. And this is obviously shaping our Russia policy today. The second factor is geography. Norway and Russia are, as I mentioned, neighbors, both at land and sea. And this has fostered close links between our two nations for centuries. And in addition, Norway and Russia do not share a history of war and rivalry if you go back in time. This has been Russia's most peaceful border over the centuries, and Eastern Finnmark was one of the only two areas where the Red Army left peacefully in 1945 after having defeated the Nazis. But the bonds go back centuries before that, on a people-to-people basis, commercially, culturally. So peaceful coexistence has really been the norm, both on the national level and especially among those living as neighbors along the border in the far north. We have a long tradition of cooperating when it's in our mutual interest and when we face common challenges, which is of course also a necessity given the conditions in the Arctic. So together, these two factors illustrate why Russia remains a key factor in Norwegian foreign policy. And Russia has always presented, I would say, its fair share of opportunities and challenges. And successive Norwegian governments have to find a way of dealing with Russia that best secures our national interests. So relations with Russia are very high on our foreign policy agenda, and unfortunately, I would say mostly for negative reasons today. Russia presents a number of challenges to the interests of Norway and our key partners, and this is, I think, especially true in the area of military and security policy, where we have seen a somewhat worrisome trend over the last, let's say, 20 years. We see a Russia that has significantly strengthened its military capabilities during the past few years, not least on the Kola Peninsula, which remains the highest density of nuclear weapons anywhere on the globe. This military modernization has been accompanied by large-scale, more complex exercises, frequently unannounced military exercises, as well as an increasing pattern of operation well into the North Atlantic, into the North Sea, and at times very close to our territorial waters. And this is one of the reasons for Norway being a very strong proponent of transparency and predictability regarding exercises and military activities. And we should expect Russia to show the same degree of transparency as we do and our allies do, but unfortunately that is of course not the case today. And such a lack of transparency contributes negatively to good neighborly relations or reducing the level of tensions in today's Europe. And only through transparency and predictability can we lower the risk of misunderstandings and dangerous escalations, not least in the high north. And this is something we consistently stress in our talks with the Russians. So this development is also why Norway has worked very closely with like-minded allies, not least the US and the UK, to renew NATO's understanding of the North and the North Atlantic as a strategic theater, pushing for reform of the NATO command structure, a new maritime doctrine, updated graduated response plans for the region. And NATO's exercise, Trident Juncture 2018, was the biggest NATO exercise in the region for approximately 30 years. And in addition, we, on a national level, have substantially strengthened our defense capabilities, increasing defense spending and having reached 2% this year. So maintaining that balance between deterrence and reassurance vis-a-vis Russia is fundamental for Norwegian security policy. And it is ever more important, I would say, in light of the increasing military activity by Russia and a growing military presence in the region, also by key NATO allies. Norway is a strong proponent of NATO's two-track approach, but stressing that it must be focused, meaningful, and from a position of strength. Our positions are also clear regarding other Russian policies, other Russian actions. Russia's aggression in eastern Ukraine, the destabilization of Ukraine, have led to a conflict that has claimed thousands of lives. And its illegal annexation of Crimea showed its blatant disregard for international law. And both actions have weakened not only Ukraine's, but of course the whole of Europe's and the transatlantic security. So together with the US and other allies, we have been very firm in our condemnation of Russia's actions, and Norway is fully aligned with the European Union's restrictive measures when it comes to Russia. We consider it vital that we continue to seek transatlantic unity in our approach and in maintaining the sanctions and the restrictive measures. So Russia's response to our policies and our clear positions on these issues has been to step up with very strong verbal attacks on Norwegian security and defense policy. And in particular, our close bilateral defense cooperation with the US and other allies. And Russian accusations in this regard have become much more pronounced during the last few years. Another source of contention is our criticism of the human rights situation in Russia, and it is clear that it is becoming increasingly difficult and serious. And we cannot ignore serious human rights abuses and repression measures of that kind. We see that Russia's laws on so-called foreign agents, undesirable organizations, not only undermine the work of local civil society and weakens human rights, but they also hamper cooperation between Russian NGOs with their Norwegian partners. And has serious implications for the people-to-people cooperation in the North, which is very much built around civil society. So we see that the Russian government's actions, both at home and abroad, pose challenges that we have to address and that limit the scope of our bilateral relations. But within these constraints, I would say that our policy is always to seek dialogue and cooperation where it is possible. We believe that we should engage the Russians where we have common interests and where non-cooperation would cause more harm than good, so to say. Some examples of this that are actually well functioning today, I would say resource management and practical cooperation. We see that our joint fisheries management in the Barents Sea has stabilized the stock of cod and prevented overfishing, which was a serious problem if you go back a few decades. And today, this is probably the largest, best managed stock of cod and perhaps of fish stock anywhere in the world. And it shows that we can cooperate with Russia despite disagreements in other areas, provided we have a common interest in doing so. Other examples are projects to handle nuclear safety, nuclear waste, which has been stockpiled very, very close to the Norwegian border in the north, and improve the environment. So these are other efforts or areas of joint effort that I would say have not been affected by the political developments in Russia. And we really appreciate the cooperation with Russia in these areas, and we maintain several formal structures in the form of bilateral commissions to keep that cooperation going. Another example is our two countries' approach to multilateral cooperation in the Arctic, such as the Arctic Council, where we generally see Russia's contribution as constructive. I would say that the Arctic overall remains an area of relatively low tension, even despite Russia's military buildup. And we work hard to keep it that way. And I would say that same goes for all the other members of the Arctic Council and the Barents-Euro-Arctic Cooperation. And these are, of course, the two main multilateral bodies for the region. And we can come back to that perhaps in the discussion. But where we have common goals, we still believe it important to work toward them through dialogue, practical cooperation, and engagement. And I would say we also look forward to working closely with Russia when they take over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council in May of next year. So another point I would like to highlight in that regard is that there is no legal vacuum in the Arctic. And of course, this is a question that very often comes up. There is an extensive legal governance framework that applies to the region. And we believe that the law of the sea forms really a solid basis for cooperation. So no need for new governance mechanisms, as some seem to suggest. And we really believe that we need an international debate on the Arctic that should be based on facts. We see that, of course, that the broader geopolitical situation affects the Arctic, but I would say regrettably, we still hear exaggerated assessments about tensions and conflicts and sort of this ongoing resource race in the region that are, at least occasionally, rather hyped. But of course, engaging the Russian authorities also requires functioning lines of communication. So Norway maintained close contacts with the Russian government. We have kept the political dialogue open, also over the last 4 to 5 years. And key Norwegian institutions such as the Coast Guard and the Border Guard cooperate very well with their Russian counterparts. And in addition, a military to military hotline has been in operation for years, with, of course, the aim of addressing incidents and avoiding unintended escalation. We also seek to engage Russia on other international arenas. Come January, Norway will become a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we will try to explore avenues for cooperating with Russia on solving crises and common challenges where that is possible within the mandate of the Council. And of course, Russia's track record on the Council gives us absolutely no illusions that this will be easy, but we will continue to seek engagement and consensus where it can be reached. I would say the same goes for the OSCE, the Council of Europe, other important parts of the European security and political infrastructure, where we often find ourselves on opposite sides of the issues with Russia, but still try to find common ground where that remains possible. So I think I'll leave it at that for my initial remarks, and we can come back to other aspects such as the economy, the environment, the work of the Arctic Council, or other examples in the discussion. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You've given us a lot here to think about. And I want to thank you very much for that very broad narrative, which also provided some wonderful insight, not only to the current relationship, but foreshadowing the future relationship. Let me open it first. I have many questions, but let me open it to my colleagues first for their thoughts and reactions, and maybe a question or two before I ask a question follow up, and then we'll start taking questions from those who have provided some online. Matt, I'll ask you perhaps to go first and ask a question or provide some insight, and then Dan, I'll come to you, and then we'll keep going in this rather organic discussion that we'll have here for the next hour.
Sure. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Secretary Halvorsen. I have had Norwegian security very much on the mind as the last couple of nights I've been streaming The 12th Man on Netflix, a kind of fun but also very bleak, very winter-appropriate World War II true adventure story. So I appreciate especially kind of some of the images that your remarks conjured in my mind. Just a couple of thoughts and a couple of questions to put on the table, and then you address them however and whenever you like. Bigger picture, I find it very interesting in the case of Norway that we're clearly balancing two fairly exclusive sets of interests that in the case of Norway, they seem to coexist. In other cases, for instance, with the United States, the coexistence is much less comfortable. And what I mean by that is, NATO solidarity being kind of a core NATO ally, very much a a core kind of participant in the transatlantic and European family of nations. And that means standing up against, Russian destabilizing and norm violating behavior. And yet, I think your remarks underscored many times in many ways pursuing cooperation, overlapping interests, and engagement, right? This magic, the E word, engagement. I wonder if there's some secret sauce that you can, other than obviously not being the United States, right? Which, if you listen to Vladimir Putin's press conference this morning, again, the United States was practically the great Satan, right? There was the hand of the American special services behind everything bad happening in and around Russia. Not surprising. Of course, Norway is not the United States, but I wonder if there's some ethos, some philosophy, if you will, you could sort of share with us, especially as we in the United States take the opportunity of a changing of the guard in the administration to think about how to more successfully, more effectively balance these two sets of concerns, pushing back on Russia, but engaging and cooperating when it makes sense. That seems to be a fundamental dilemma. And then I want to ask more specifically about one aspect, and that's the people-to-people aspect. You and Norway have a shared border. You have shared communities in the high north, many shared, for example, environmental aspects of life, but also human aspects. And I want to ask this in a specific context. This is not to pick on Norway regarding the recent tit-for-tat spy espionage issues. We have had our own in the United States, as you know, in recent years. But it's the context question. How do you maintain effective people-to-people links in a context where we know that, at least in terms of dealing with the Russian side, the gatekeepers are the Siloviki. The gatekeepers are the security services, and they really control that. As a former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, John Byerly famously always said that the giant dial in the Kremlin, sort of turning up the temperature, turning down the temperature anytime they want. I wonder if you have any kind of recipe for insulating that, ensuring that it works, not letting it get taken hostage to some of these sort of tit for tat, almost Cold War dynamics around mutual suspicion and espionage and so forth. And then just the last issue I wanted to throw out on the table, again, I don't have per se a pointed question on this. That's the pandemic. How is that looking in the kind of shared human space of the high north? How's it looking as between Russia and Norway?
Sorry, just some technical issues there. But thank you, Matt, for excellent comments and questions. And I think they are very much interconnected, actually, because if you look at this, your initial thoughts on this balancing act, I think that has very much been the Norwegian approach over time, going back decades, even back to the Cold War and the relationship to the Soviet Union. And part of that is very much dependent on exactly the people-to-people cooperation. And as I mentioned very briefly, of course, in the northern parts of Norway, the Red Army were seen as liberators, and they were liberators. And they withdrew peacefully after having liberated these territories. And that is a legacy that is not easily broken, so to say, and has really influenced how the people across the border view each other over time, combined with ties going back even further. But the people-to-people cooperation really picked up in the early 1990s as part of the Barents Cooperation introduced in 1993. And from the Norwegian government side, we fund and have funded, we probably spend $35 million each year on projects and exchanges and education programs, cultural programs across the border, being managed by local stakeholders and local networks. So it's a hugely important part of maintaining that trust and transparency across the border. And it's very popular. It's very popular both on the Russian side and also, of course, on the Norwegian side. So that has been key part of maintaining, I would say, one leg of the relationship. But I have to say, it is becoming more difficult. It is becoming more difficult in light of the political changes on the Russian side, in the changes in Russian legislation, but also in the culture, where, as you know, the West is being portrayed more and more as an opponent. And of course, that having now gone on over time really threatens to weaken these links, and we are seeing signs of that happening. And then, of course, the environment for cooperation is much less conducive now than it was before 2013. We still continue to fund the programs, and we will continue to do so, and try to maintain the links as close as possible. But it is becoming more difficult, and we see that the actors on the Russian side that have always been skeptical, always suspicious of this cooperation, are gaining ground. So it's becoming more difficult to maintain it. And I think that is an impression that all NGOs and all sort of foreign actors working in Russia will recognize. On the practical side, of course, on some of these aspects, when it comes to the cooperation in the north, there really is no alternative but cross-border cooperation. Looking at search and rescue operations, for example, looking at environmental questions, as I mentioned, nuclear safety. We have the nickel plant just across the border, which has been spewing out the sulfur for decades. And working together on these questions is really, for people to live and feel safe and secure in their day-to-day environment. It's really it really has to happen. So it's also a deed of necessity, and maintaining that has been also, I think, a confidence building measure to some extent during more difficult times on the sort of national level.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate that. Matt's comments and thoughts were spot on. I kept writing down the two words that I have heard from my Norwegian colleagues, and certainly have read in many documents: deterrence and reassurance. Those two words often come up in terms of relationship with the Russian Federation. I think you've just highlighted that careful balancing act between deterrence and reassurance. Let me now welcome into the conversation the director of our Global Europe program, Dan Hamilton. Dan?
Thank you, Mike. Secretary, that's great to be here with you. I appreciate your comments. You said at the very beginning of your remarks, Norway is a small country. But in the Arctic, I've always been struck with how Norway is a big power. There's a real contrast there when you think about how Norway acts in the region. And I've also appreciated how Norway's tried to balance, being a good ally and a good neighbor. And that, as Matt has said, that's a balancing act people can learn from. And earlier, over time, successive Norwegian governments have said that it's really important to make sure the high north is an area of low tension, and how you balance that. So if we think about those aspects today, you talk about security geography. I just had a couple questions for you along those lines. You mentioned you have a hotline and do things together bilaterally with Russia to make sure there's no miscommunication. But NATO and Russia have had trouble in that area. The incidents of near air collisions, of transponders being turned off, of the risk of accidents has grown considerably at a time when sort of the framework of confidence building measures in Europe has sort of collapsed. And there are any number now of suggestions, and I think particularly with the new US administration, what can be done between NATO and Russia, maybe with Norwegian experience, to mitigate risk, to reduce the possibility of accidents, incidents, beyond sort of isolated, sort of channels that we might have. I think it's an important one. You mentioned the issue of transparency. The US under the Trump administration left the Open Skies Treaty. It's difficult now to procedurally in the US to understand how we would return to that. We might have to go back to the Senate if we would do that. so how Norway might think about the future of a treaty like that too, going forward as part of that bundle. The other is sort of your point about geography. Norway is a NATO ally, is linked to some other NATO allies who also have some concerns about Russia and the Baltic states. But between you and them are two non-NATO partners who are also, of course, very close partners to Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And while the cooperation has always been close, and the Swedes recently have made some interesting noises now about default NATO possibilities, Norway's always been very clear about drawing that line with its Swedish and Finnish colleagues, saying you are not a NATO ally. Being an ally really means something. And the Balts have been nervous also about Russia, but then not sure they can count on Sweden and Finland really, because they're not really, within the alliance. So an example is Baltic Air Policing. This has been an effort to try to, help the Baltic states with their own sense of security, but it's not a NATO operation because of some of these concerns with the Swedes and the Finns being involved. Do you see some evolution maybe in that toward a NATO kind of effort? I would think a Norwegian voice there would be quite important. And then my last point is, again, whereas this balance between connecting and engaging with Russia and having some concerns, and it's the digital space. This is the world we're in now. There was a hack on the Norwegian parliament, I believe directly attributed to Russia, which caused some political concerns in Norway, clearly. But on the other hand, you see efforts in the Arctic region to try to connect digitally. There's an Arctic Connect project that's being organized with Finland, particularly, but with Russia and Chinese companies. But I believe there's a trunk line that will go over to Norway because parts of Norway want to be connected too, and using the Arctic space as a way to connect digitally seems to be a new frontier of engagement. And I just wonder how you're thinking about that as you balance these different priorities.
Thank you, Dan. I'll try to answer briefly, but these are great questions. When it comes to the hotline and having the tools to maintain contact if necessary, of course, this has been an ongoing debate in NATO, where sort of in the end no solution was found on the mill-to-mill contacts, and of course the dialogue in the NATO-Russia Council really has been lacking, and I would say not for lack of trying from the ally side, but in getting the Russians to engage in substantial questions in a meaningful way, I would say has been the problem. The hotline as such between the headquarters of the Northern Fleet and the Norwegian joint headquarters in Bodø, it's actually a Skype line. They test it every week. They call each other up on Skype. They have the connection open. They know whom to speak with, and it works. We've used it on occasion. What we haven't seen the same level of unpredictability and sort of blatant aggressive behavior in Norwegian territory or territorial waters or airspace as you have seen, for example, in the Baltic Sea. We have had several instances of aggressive flying simulated attack patterns against Norwegian targets or against allied naval forces on exercise, and also flying very close to our maritime patrol aircraft in the Barents Sea, but not the breach of national airspace, for example, that you have seen towards Sweden or Finland and in the Baltics. So it is somewhat different. And we raise our concerns directly with the Russians when they occur. And our intelligence services have been very public about this, actually showing what they are doing and what this would entail in a real situation. And I think that has worked to an extent. We also had several instances of GPS jamming across the border in Finnmark, which of course has potentially huge consequences, not only militarily, but towards civilian electronic infrastructure, rescue services, aircraft landing at the local airport, for example. So this is something that we also raised directly with the Russians, and after that we have seen no instances in that regard. When it comes to transparency and sort of the whole arms control regime around Europe, it's really in a sad state right now. Of course, we have expressed our regret that the US left the Open Skies Treaty, but there is also no doubt that the Russians have been in breach of their obligations. But I think in the short term, it's going to be hard to see what we are able to do beyond trying to maintain what is left still, and then try to build on that. Looking at sort of the Baltic and high North security picture together, I would say that has been one of the most clear developments in the regional threat perception over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. The understanding, which is now shared between the Nordic and Baltic and Northern European actors, that these two theaters are very much one. And of course, the route to the Baltics for, let's say, reinforcements from continental US goes through the North Atlantic. And that means that you have to see these things in a connected way. And that also influences NATO's planning and thinking in a whole different way. And that's shared understanding and perception has allowed for much more substantial discussions between the Nordic and Baltic countries, be they NATO members, EU members or not, on I would say also very concrete issues such as capabilities development, sharing of information, doing joint planning. And there is very much an evolution ongoing in this. You have the regional network, which is called NORDEFCO, which is the Nordic Defense Cooperation. But you also have increasingly strong bonds on a bilateral and trilateral level, the latest being a new trilateral agreement between Norway, Sweden, and Finland as to more joint planning and increasing our defense cooperation on all levels. And I think this goes very much hand in hand with NATO. And of course, Sweden and Finland, I would say, are as integrated with NATO as you can be without being an actual member. And as you say, for Norway, and I would say for NATO members, there is a line there. The line is Article 5 and the automatic guarantee, which is inherent in Article 5. But it's an excellent cooperation, and they are very close partners. And of course, also on the bilateral level with the US, now with new host support agreements and bilateral agreements, and a much stronger operational cooperation. Looking at the digital picture, we experienced an attack towards the Norwegian Parliament earlier this autumn. And this is the first time we have directly attributed it to the Russians. And in light of the information we possessed, there was no doubt about it. So this was a political attribution made by the Norwegian government, and then we've had a police investigation ongoing as well, which has been concluded and which pointed in the same direction very, very clearly. Of course, being independent of the executive as such. But these attacks are ongoing all the time. And in this case, being an attack on our key democratic body, so to say, the Norwegian Parliament, it was important for us to shout out, I would say, against this behavior. And you need to draw the line somewhere. And of course, this has been ongoing in Europe and across the Atlantic for years, and it continues every day. But we need to call them when we see them. Is I think the approach. Oh, just one point on the Arctic Connect. My understanding is that this is being driven primarily by private Finnish actors with potential funding from China, but still very much up in the air. So these are difficult conditions to work under, of course, drawing that kind of infrastructure through the Northeast Passage. So we'll see how it sort of develops over time. But looking at broadband, for example, accessibility and penetration, the Norwegian High North actually has much better broadband than large parts of continental Europe. So it's this part of the Arctic is very much connected and digital already, and that also has consequences for what we can do in the regional cooperation, such as focusing on e-health, long-distance education, and other important priorities for both our domestic policies and also in the regional cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Dan and Matt for starting this conversation off so well. Perhaps we have a number of questions, Mr. Secretary, and I'm going to put them in some buckets so that we can work through them. The first is, can you connect the major themes out of the new High North White Paper, foreign policy, security, economic development? Can you tie those to what you think the implications are for the relationship between Norway and Russia? Are there opportunities there? Are parts of the white paper designed to counter or enhance or integrate further with your ongoing Russia-Norway cooperation? Was it written in a context for Norway? Was it written in an Arctic context? Or was it written in a context that is taking into consideration the Norwegian-Russian relationship? So that's one theme. The second is, can you please comment on the current situation in Svalbard? Perhaps talk a little bit about that treaty, but more importantly, what do you see in terms of Russian-Norwegian interactions there, Russian messaging in Svalbard, and do you consider that a possible tension point anytime in the future? That's another bucket of multiple questions. A third, since you brought up China, is Norway's perspective on Chinese investment in Norway, but also in other Arctic nations. And I'll give you one more bucket, which would be how does Norway balance the need for economic development in the north, like most northern countries, and impacts and implications for the environment, which is changing dramatically as we speak today? So I've tried as best as I can to bring those into themes that I'm hoping then my colleagues can interact with you based on your answers and your thoughts on those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Big buckets. No, but we presented our new white paper to Parliament only a couple of weeks ago. It's right here. It's about 200 pages. It was the first white paper on the issue for 9 years. So conditions in and around the Arctic have changed since 2011. There will be a English substantive summary at some point early in 2021, and hopefully you will be able to use that as also to gain broader insights in the Norwegian policies on these issues. And actually, the three levels you mentioned, Mike, are very much interconnected, and that interconnection is what informs the white paper as such. Because the previous white papers presented to Parliament on Arctic issues have been very broad, very sort of outward-looking, focusing on foreign policy, on the international aspects of the High North and the Arctic. In this white paper, we maintain sort of that perspective. With a new analysis of the geopolitical dynamics, the role of the Arctic in geopolitics, great power dynamics, and such. But we also sort of go down a level to see at the relationship between domestic policies, the development of our own Arctic region, and how that needs to be shaped to meet the new challenges, not least the challenge from climate change and from the international dynamics, but also challenges when it comes to demography, for example, with people moving south, maintaining a level of population that will continue to serve sort of a national interest. And to sort of understand the paper, I think you also need to understand the European and the Norwegian Arctic, which is very different from the North American Arctic. In Norway, more 550,000 people live above the Arctic Circle. We have major population centers. As I said, we have a better broadband penetration than much of continental Europe. We have innovative technology industries. We have fisheries. We have marine services industries. We have several universities. So this is a place where people live, where we need to continue to develop infrastructure to create jobs, to have culture and available, and make sure people want to live. So looking at the dynamic between those two levels, and also I would say the regional pictures, what makes sense to do across borders, what makes sense to do within the Barents regional and state-to-state level cooperation, what makes sense to bring to the Arctic Council. And looking just at distances, a lot of cross-border cooperation, of course, makes sense. What kind of infrastructure should be developed across borders? So looking at all these three levels together was really the purpose of this white paper. And to a certain extent, I would say that the Russian Arctic across the border is very much the same. This is the region in the Arctic where the most people live. Murmansk has 300,000 people or so living there. 2.5 million people live in northwestern Russia. So this is also, so on a lot of these issues, we have similar interests, and we need to maintain the infrastructure and develop the regions while having a sustainable resource development. So Svalbard. Svalbard, of course, is Norwegian territory, and Norway's sovereignty over Svalbard is undisputed. And what is often misunderstood is that the crux, so to say, or the core of the Svalbard Treaty is non-discrimination and the equal treatment of the state parties, citizens and businesses, not the states themselves. So it is the citizens and businesses of the parties that have a right to equal treatment within certain defined areas, such as mining, such as hunting and commercial activities. Svalbard is a Norwegian community. It is changing from a community built around coal mining, which of course in the current prices has not been viable and not environmentally viable for quite some time. So it is changing in a way into a more modern, sustainable community. Approximately 2,700 people live in Longyearbyen, which is a Norwegian community, and then we have approximately 450 people living in Barentsburg, which is the base of the Russian mining company Trust Arctic Google. But of course, it is regulated. It is Norwegian. It is regulated by Norwegian law and Norwegian regulation. And on a day-to-day basis, it works very well. We experienced that the dialogue with the Russian company and Russian authorities that have a consulate in Svalbard works well. They respect Norwegian regulation, and it is, I would say, on the practical level, well functioning. There was a tragic helicopter accident a few years back with a Russian helicopter crashing with 8 people being killed. Russian rescue services were very respectful of Norwegian sovereignty and Norwegian jurisdiction, very helpful in that regard. So, but of course, on the political level, we see Russian messaging with a message that they want to discuss Svalbard issues, which we of course don't do. We don't discuss sovereignty issues or jurisdiction issues with any of the parties to the conference. This is Norwegian territory. and I would say that their points of view are well known. They have been constant for decades. But what is new is a very public messaging as to their displeasure with the Norwegian management, so to say, of Svalbard, and so there are some issues that continue to pop up, and in a very direct manner, as the Russian MFA also often does. China, and this might, with looking at it from Washington, this might sound a bit controversial, but I would argue that the Chinese presence and sort of footprint in the Arctic is currently not the threat that it's being made up to be. And I will my arguments for that is that I think the awareness of the potential of China in the Arctic is much higher than some years back. And what we see is generally sort of a few real cases generating a lot of attention without there necessarily being a lot of substance beyond the attention it is given. Of course, there are major Chinese investments when it comes to energy in Russia, the LNG fields, Novatek, for example. But beyond that, if you start going concretely into the aspects, it is a bit exaggerated at times. And I think the attention among the Arctic countries as to the potential challenges that major investments, for example, would entail, it has really risen, and there is much more vigilance, much more cooperation between the countries, much stronger dialogue. And of course, for the Russians as well, this is a dilemma. This is their a highly prioritized strategic region for them. Now, how far will they let the Chinese in? I think that is an ongoing discussion, so to say, on the Russian side. From Norway's side, we have been very clear. We do not wish to have any kind of BRI cooperation with China or any BRI MOU. We maintain a dialogue on Arctic issues, and we have a general perspective where we would say we welcome outside actors as long as they respect the established governance frameworks and respect international law. And so far, I would say China is doing that. But of course, it is something we are following very closely, and we see not least actors close to the Chinese government that bring a different perspective into the region, trying to more actively challenge the established norms and regimes that are there. So is it a potential challenge going forward? Obviously, is it something where we have to be very vigilant and work together as allies and friends, obviously, as well. But I would say that this is sometimes exaggerated a bit.
Thank you. Matt, let me open the floor to you again.
No, I simply would comment on the territorial issue and the kind of management of what have been really poisonous dynamics in other parts of the European and Eurasian space as quite a positive example. Again, I'm really in search at this very kind of open-ended moment. We don't know for sure yet what will be the theme, if there will be a sort of central arc to the new U.S. administration posture on Russia. One might argue the relationship could hardly be more contentious or adversarial, and yet the Russian optimist in me would say it could always be worse. And so I'm very much in search of kind of models for more successful management. And one of the issues that arises there is the issue of sanctions. And again, I know this is an area where Norway has balanced, as Dan underscored as well, the interest in transatlantic solidarity and European solidarity with the need to maintain certain levels of engagement. I would argue there's also a kind of psychological dimension to sanctions that has bled into other areas of bilateral interaction, and I'd be curious how you manage this, which is we've reached the point now after 6 years of increasingly intense, and now the European Union has again extended Ukraine-related sanctions for another 6 months, increasingly permanent Western sanctions on Russia, that a lot of the Russian people basically believe the Kremlin when the Kremlin says these sanctions are not about any specific policy, they're about hurting Russia. And I know on the American side, it's very often the case. Dan has, I think, even been on panels like this, sharing the stage with U.S. officials. I know I have, where when they are asked, well, how are the sanctions working? Tell us how the sanctions are working. I know this happens, by the way, in the European Parliament as well. The best that they can usually do is to point to damage to the Russian economy, to say essentially Russians are poorer as a result of the sanctions. What they're not able to do is point to policy changes. So I wonder, from your perspective, when you think about, in particular, energy relationships, small and medium-sized businesses, family businesses, things like that, that I know are important, and perhaps in the future, increasingly trade and transportation links in the high north. I mean, how do you think about the dynamic we're in, where it does seem inevitable that some degree of suffocation of the economy through sanctions is going to be necessary, is going to remain in place for quite a long time?
Well, I think the question of sanctions is one that, as you say, Matt, it touches really upon a lot of issues. If you look at Norway, Russia, as I said, we have aligned with all the EU measures, going back to Crimea and of course the Donbass especially. So from what happened was that what had the most direct consequences for the Norwegian-Russian commercial relationship was, of course, that the sanctions were introduced on specific kinds of energy cooperation and deep water offshore technology exchange, for example, which was at the very core of a lot of the commercial activity going on between Norway and Russia, and a lot of the interest from, or a lot of the presence and the investments from the Norwegian energy companies and supply and technology companies were specifically sort of within that sector and within that niche. So that was cut off almost overnight in 2014. And then, of course, as the Russians did their countermeasures, they struck at seafood exports, which was the second big leg, so to say, of the commercial relationship. Completely unfounded, with a sort of no relation to technology transfer or anything, but it hit at the heart of the economy. So it was purely a retaliatory measure. So the seafood exports also dropped almost to zero within a year. And of course, that has lasting impact. So what we are seeing now is that Norwegian businesses, Russian businesses are trying to work within a much narrower framework where the potential is it's much smaller. And there is room to develop the economic relationship within sectors that are sort of not sanctioned and are not in any way dangerous, so to say. A lot more attention is, of course, being given to dual-use technology and sort of export of civilian exports that can be used for military purposes. But still, there is obviously a room to develop economic relationship. It is still ongoing, I would say, on a day-to-day basis, with people going across the border to buy electronics on the Norwegian side or gasoline on the Russian side. So that is actually a pretty big economy across the border already. But as to the sort of the bigger perspective, will this induce, in the end, behavioral changes on the Russian side? I don't know, but I think the maintenance remains important, not least as a to illustrate allied cohesion and allied unity in reacting to completely unacceptable behavior in breach of international law. And I would say, I am in many ways, to be honest, a bit positively surprised that cohesion is still holding. I don't think that was a given if you look at politics across Europe just a few years back. So I think that's a sign of unity, at least in difficult circumstances.
Thank you for that. I have a follow-up to that, and then I'm going to go to my colleague, Dan. Mr. Secretary, a couple of things have come up over the last, I would say, 6 months related to the transatlantic alliance. And many of us have looked to the Arctic Council as perhaps an internal to the alliance, an internal mechanism for confidence building amongst allies, that's a place where we can maybe re-energize relationships that may have been stressed over the last few years. So I'd wonder about your thoughts in terms of the importance of the Arctic Council internal to at least the transatlantic alliance. I'd also like your thoughts on the role of the Arctic Council vis-a-vis Norway to engage and perhaps advance issues between Norway and Russia. Is the Arctic Council and the Arctic Economic Council, are those two mechanisms that could help further the relationship between Norway and Russia? And what do you suspect could be some opportunities while Russia takes the chairmanship of the Arctic Council? I realize there's a lot there, but those themes do run together. And then after your comments, I'll turn the floor over to my colleague, Dan.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Well, first of all, for Norway, the Arctic Council is a hugely important regional format. And I think not only on the political level, but also in a very practical level, with the work of the working groups, on the research cooperation, on the cooperation agreements that have been signed on oil spill preparedness, on cooperation in the exchange of Arctic research data, for example. So I think it is two things. It is a political arena for discussions on issues of mutual interest, and it is a very sort of practical tool in dealing with policy issues and practical issues in the region, and maintaining that dual approach, I think, has been very much part of why the Arctic Council is seen as a success. And of course, there has been a clear understanding between the members of keeping hard security issues off the agenda, and I think that also has been part of the success of the council. And I would say that because even as sort of tensions spill into the region, or actually they come back into the region, even though for the past 25 years, this has been a part of the world where we have been able to focus only on cooperation and dialogue and working together. If you go back before that to the Cold War, this was, of course, an area of very high tension, and that part was, in a way, it was always there with the Russian Northern Fleet and the strategic importance of the Kola Peninsula and the Russian bastion, so to say. But we had the luxury of being able to forget it, in a sense, for some decades. So I think the challenge going forward for the Council and for us as allies and for like-minded is going to be able to sort of to keep working within the framework of the Council, using the pieces that have served us very well, to focus on mutual challenges, not least the consequences of climate change, which is of course going to impact us all hugely. It is happening at a tremendous pace in the Arctic, while being forced to be much more conscious of that strategic dimension as well that has been re-emerging. And of course, the there are discussions as to whether hard security and strategic issues should be brought on the council's agenda. We do not support that. I think we have other formats which are more suitable for that. And the problem right now is not the lack of formats for talking. It is the will, primarily on the Russian side, of course, to actually engage in substantive, constructive, good faith talks. But that being said, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, I would say that the Russians have a constructive approach to the council, and they have seen it, I think, also as in their self-interest, as a tool to maintain a sense of control over developments in the region. As you know, this is a consensus organ, so highly controversial national interest issues will be blocked by one or more of the members. And rather than having Arctic discussions about the Arctic taking place outside the auspice of the council, I think there's also an interest in maintaining that sort of grip on those discussions. There have been signals I've seen in the Russian media and with statements as to the Russian wish to sort of bring that security dimension into the council. We haven't seen that anything concrete on that yet, but this is obviously a development that we have to follow. And they have not been very clear on their priorities for their chairmanship yet. Which of course they are taking over from Iceland in May.
Thank you. Dan?
Yes, so I was thinking about Matt's point about are there examples in this area, in this region, that offer lessons. And it's always struck me that the Arctic is not just an institution. The Arctic, you mentioned the Arctic Council, and then there's the Law of the Sea. But the Arctic is what at least some scholars would call a regime. It's a whole set of norms and principles and rules and processes that involve both state and non-state actors. And the Arctic Council is maybe the hub of those networks. But what makes the Arctic regime innovative is that it is, open to experimentation, including with countries that don't always agree. And I think that's where some lessons can be found of how you balance, rights of non-state actors. I mean, the Arctic Council has the whole, indigenous peoples represented. There's a whole nother dimension to this beyond, a state-to-state type of process. And I realize you said earlier in your remarks, you're not looking for more governance structures. But if you think about the Arctic regime, the way I'm trying to describe it, I wonder if you think there are lessons for others, or whether you think there are other things that could be done in terms of these informal networks, other types of arrangements that might mitigate some of the, as I said, some of the security concerns you have. And related, the environmental concern. I mean, the Arctic is now, in my sense, the canary in the coal mine about climate change. It's a cold region, but it's the fastest warming region on Earth. And can you really afford to wait for the Paris Climate Accords and all these things to move ahead? Or can't there be, and shouldn't there be more done in a regional basis that would, by nature, have to include Russia? I know there's a lot of work going on, but I'm not sure it's apparent, more widely what actually is happening in that space.
I think you're very right in pointing to this regime, as you call it, and how not only the Arctic Council has been able to work on many levels, but also this is the core idea of the Barents Council and the Barents Corporation, where you have On the state-to-state level, you have the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, and then you have a regional council composed of the 14 regions. And you have a joint chairmanship with Norway now currently being the chair of the Barents Arctic Council, and then Västerbotten, the region in Sweden, chairing the regional council. And of course, also working with indigenous people who are represented on all levels, hugely important. And that, of course, also goes back to the Arctic Council, where you see that the working groups have been very highly integrated with the research community, with academic institutions, and also trying to bring on board, going back to Mike's point, the Arctic Economic Cooperation Council, where we try to bring businesses together and developing joint products and sort of getting that cross-regional dimension. So it is, I think, a good illustration of your point. What I would say is that this is working well because it has been developed over time, I think, and with the actors actually spending resources on it. I mentioned the funding we do for the people-to-people programs, and of course, this is something where the actors over time have been willing to establish the necessary structures through the working groups of the council being financed by the parties, establishing a permanent secretariat and sort of building layer upon layer of cooperation. And is that possible to transfer sort of beyond the Arctic? Possibly, but I don't have any sort of any silver bullet as to how that could be done. But I think it's an object for study that perhaps could have or generate interest on other parts of the globe. The environment, we could talk much more about that, but as you say, this climate change is very real in the Arctic. Just over the last year, seeing now the developments on the Greenland ice shelf, this is, as one example, Svalbard has had 31 consecutive years of above average temperatures as far back as we have data, and warming is happening at more than 3 times the global pace. So this is happening before our eyes, and of course the implications of that with the melting ice in the Polar Sea, possible thawing of the permafrost. This has huge implications for today's Arctic. But this is not something that can be addressed on a regional level due to the fact that most of the emissions creating this change do not originate in the region, they originate beyond the region. So you get a sort of an interface, so to say, or a negative spiral between regional developments in the Arctic affecting weather patterns and ocean temperatures, driving changes on a global level and vice versa. And it's hugely concerning. And of course, the Arctic is quite literally melting before our eyes. So that is why we hope that all countries step up to their climate obligations under the Paris Treaty, and Norway is a strong proponent of the Paris Treaty. And I really don't think there are any alternatives on the global level and in sort of getting the necessary results other than bringing together the whole global community. And of course, the Paris Accord is in no way perfect, but it is the tool that we have to generate, should I say, a common approach. And we very much welcome, I would say, the signals of the new U.S. administration to step back into this Paris Treaty. It's going to be hugely important to have the U.S. back in driving that agenda on a global scale.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Perhaps that's a perfect way to end this discussion before I hand it over to Matt for some closing thoughts, is that we've explored those 2 words we talked about earlier, deterrence and reassurance, across a long list of issues. I want to thank you very much for providing great insight here today on a whole host of issues. And thank you for spending your evening with us there in Norway. We know it's been a long day for you. Matt, let me turn it to you for some closing thoughts and a conclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Dan, and of course, thank you, Mr. State Secretary. I would simply say this has been a valuable discussion to learn about the unique dynamics of the Norway-Russia relationship, to learn about the broader security, environmental, and human dynamics in the Arctic region, which we follow closely, but also as an illustration of a principle that is going to be very much discussed. It already has been very much discussed with the arrival of the Biden administration in Washington over the next several months, and that is the value of alliances. There is going to be, I think it's almost a foregone conclusion, a re-emphasis on especially the transatlantic alliance. And I would simply underscore, as someone who works on engagement with Russia and managing a competitive and contentious relationship, that some of the value of those alliances is in learning, is in insights from what allies do that is a little bit different, that is complementary, and that maybe in some cases can help in a kind of balancing partnership. Allies can do things we Americans cannot do, and vice versa. And I think that this conversation has been especially illustrative of that. And I'm very grateful to you, Mr. State Secretary, for entertaining my questions and my attempts to learn from you and your example. So thank you all once again. Thanks to those who joined us and submitted questions. And we will be continuing this series, and we hope to speak with you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you again.